Today we're taking a look at some new work that's been done on the radiocarbon dating of the Shroud of Turin back in 1988. I'll be right back. Hey there, Gracious Gang. It's Mike from thegraciousguest.org here with you with another episode of The Gracious Guest Show. And I'm delighted you've joined us today. Today we're returning to the topic of the Shroud of Turin and specifically looking at that radiocarbon dating in 1988 that was performed by three labs. And then most especially we're going to focus on the actual report that generated and some potentially questionable circumstances surrounding the publication of that report. Before we do that, though, I want to please invite you to subscribe to this channel if you've not done so already. We've been having a real surge of subscriptions to this channel, and I'm really just profoundly grateful and just sort of shocked about how much the channel has really been growing. And there's a lot of great questions being asked. There's a lot of great conversations that are coming out of this content. And so I hope to keep producing as much of it as I possibly can for you. I've got a pretty busy schedule at the school that I teach at, but I love to get at least one or two interviews out per month is what I'm sort of committing to lately. So thanks again so much for those of you who have been subscribed to for a while, and share this far and wide if you would. Today I'm joined by Mr. Michael Kowalski, and I have his background here I just want to share with you. Michael lives in Halifax, Yorkshire, a town in northern England. He graduated in physics at the University of Manchester in 1976, following which he had a short 3-year career working in the textile industry. He subsequently changed careers, joining a multinational computer company where he worked for 37 years, specializing in the development and implementation of core banking systems used by many of the UK's major financial institutions. Since taking early retirement in 2016, Michael has devoted much of his time to his study of the Holy Shroud of Turin. He's a member of the Shroud Science Group, a closed forum used by Shroud researchers from around the world to encourage communication and collaboration on matters relating to the Shroud. He is the editor of the British Society for the Turin Shroud Newsletter, which he recently took that over, succeeding our good friend of the show, David Rolfe, of course, who was the director of the original 1978 Silent Witness documentary on the Shroud of Turin, and the more recent Who Can He Be documentary as well, which we've covered on this show before. Michael's also the author of a recently published book about the Shroud titled The Shroud of Christ, Evidence of a 2,000-Year-Old Antiquity. And Michael's going to join us here in just a second to share some very intriguing data that he personally has gone through and which caught his eye really early on, right as soon as that article came out in Nature back in February of 1989, just a few months after the radiocarbon dating was performed. So without further ado, let's jump over to my interview with Michael Kowalski, editor of the British Society for the Turin Shroud Newsletter. Check it out. All right, Michael Kowalski, thank you so much for joining me here on the Gracious Guest Show today.
It's my pleasure, Mike. Thank you.
Yeah, and it's exciting here to bring up this topic that has come up a few times before, of course, the carbon dating, but in a more specific and I think particularly focused kind of way. I don't think that we've done before in here, so I'm excited to explore this with you. But before we get into that, I just, as always, I like to ask guests to share a little bit about your background, anything that really brought you to the Shroud in particular. Feel free to share.
Yes, well, the Shroud is something I've known about for quite some time. I was born and raised a Catholic, had a Catholic education, so was well aware of the Shroud during my school days. But it really wasn't until probably sometime in the mid-70s that I remember quite vividly seeing a magazine which had not only a picture of the Shroud, but also pictures of the photographic negatives. And of course, as they do for so many people, that those photographs had such a huge impact on me.
Sure.
And so I was always interested in the Shroud, but never really a student. I wouldn't go actively looking for information about the Shroud, but if it came in front of me, I'd read it. So of course I took an interest in the carbon dating when that happened.
Mm.
And was disappointed with the outcome, but it didn't really shake my faith in any way in my beliefs that the Shroud was authentic. Mainly because I just assumed that there'd been some kind of mistake made. I couldn't see how a forger could have created an image that was so compelling, and one that just struck me in the heart, quite frankly, when I first saw it.
Right.
But it really wasn't until I retired in 2016. I took early retirement. And that's when I started to take a real interest in the Shroud. And one of the things that really attracted me was something I read fairly early on about some controversies concerning the carbon dating. And that led me into a detailed examination of that particular aspect, but also all the dating evidence.
Sure.
And so since then, I've been on a little bit of a journey. Devoured several books and lots of scientific papers. Recently, I've written a book myself, which was published in June,
Yes.
called "The Shroud of Christ: Evidence of a 2,000 year antiquity."
I got that that linked below for folks to check out for sure.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And also last year, I became editor of the British Society for the Turin Shroud Newsletter, which was a big honour, succeeding David Rolfe, who was a film director, of course, and who's done an enormous amount of work over decades to bring attention to many people about the evidence that supports the Shroud's authenticity.
Sure.
So in short, that's where I'm coming from.
Yes. Well, and again, I recommend people definitely check out the links and to check out the society's newsletter, especially as well. It's been a real treat for me personally to be able to explore, whenever it comes out. And there's just so many great articles. Many folks I kind of found out about through that.
All right,
Folks who have been gracious enough to come on here as well. So it's a wonderful ongoing endeavor. But I'm no doubt, there's a lot of folks, of course, who like to basically explore all things Shroud through my channel, whether or not they do follow any of the other stuff I do on here. I do a lot of different stuff, but the Shroud, of course, has become a topic of tremendous interest for a lot of folks. So surely there's a lot of people watching this who have maybe heard of the carbon dating, have their own initial take on it, but just for those who might be a little rusty on it, do you want to walk us through here just the basics of what happened in 1988 and then maybe how that starts to connect to this publication then in Nature that really was the output of that, I believe.
Yeah. Well, of course, the carbon dating of the Shroud was probably well, it still is probably the most significant event that's taken place in over 100 years of scientific study of the Shroud. At the time that the test took place, there was a lot of evidence that had emerged that seemed to indicate the Shroud's authenticity, and so the carbon dating, which took place in 1988, this was a test that was already, even before the test took place, it had attracted a lot of media attention because as far as many people in the media were concerned, there was a debate over the Shroud's authenticity between those who believed it to be the true burial cloth of Jesus Christ and those who were very skeptical and believed it to be a medieval forgery. So in the eyes of the media, at least, the scientists involved in the carbon dating were going to be able to solve what some outlets had termed as the mystery of the century. Was the Shroud a fake or was it authentic? So it had a very, very high profile, did this test. As we know, the result was a disappointment to many people who believe in its authenticity because the result claimed that it dated from the period 1260 to 1390.
Exclamation point.
Exclamation point, yes. And that, of course, has resonated around the world. And that is probably, if you speak to most people who know anything at all about the Shroud, if they know one thing, they will know that it's been carbon dated and it must be a fake. However, let's go back to the test because obviously at the time, the test was very, very high profile. It was important, I think, for all those involved to try and make sure that this test was a success, that from a scientific point of view, it was properly conducted, properly run, and was hopefully going to deliver a result that eventually, whether it was dated into the 1st century or to the 13th century, hopefully there would be a result that everyone could accept. That was what people were hoping for. So we had the church were obviously very much the people who were leading this, and quite rightly they set about putting all the best possible conditions for a successful outcome, because they involved a lot of specialists with relevant expertise in the planning process. Incidentally, can I just mention, I hope this isn't off-putting to people, but I'm missing a tooth, which
Oh,
which I broke.
we didn't get in a fight beforehand. No, we're not even on the same continent. No.
No, I actually broke this on holiday in Italy, in Turin of all places, would you believe?
Oh,
And I'm still waiting for the dentistry work to complete. But
oh, it's
so
always
hopefully this doesn't distract people too much.
no.
But,
It's tough to get an appointment. Yeah, for sure.
but yeah, so going back to the test,
Yeah.
they involved. The church decided to involve a lot of people with relevant expertise in the planning process. So we had members of the Pontifical Academy of Science, which is the scientific body that actually advises the Pope.
Mm-hmm.
We had an archaeologist, Bill Meacham, a very experienced archaeologist with lots of field experience of using radiocarbon dating as part of his archaeological fieldwork. There was a textile specialist, Madame Fleury Lemberg.
Yes.
Members of the STURP team who'd examined the shroud in detail. That's the Shroud of Turin research project team, for those who aren't familiar with the acronym STURP. They'd examined the shroud in detail 10 years earlier, so they knew every square centimetre of that particular cloth. And of course, there was the laboratories, and there were 7 laboratories who were planned to participate in the early stages. And then finally, there was a man called Dr. Michael Tite, who was from the British Museum, and his role was to supervise the conduct of the test process, and the subsequent analysis. So it was a very, very strong team, a multidisciplinary team, and they went through a process of using a test plan that should have given the test the absolute maximum chances of success. And it included in there several key criteria, which they described as the test protocols. So, for instance, British Museum would supervise the test. There would be all 7 laboratories would be involved, because we wanted to have more than one laboratory. And also within the 7 laboratories, there were 2 types of carbon dating methods that would be employed. So one was a traditional and well-established method, which was called which was called a gas counter technique. And there were 2 laboratories that used that technique. The rest used a much more modern and less well-established method called accelerated mass spectrometry, or AMS. And that was, as I mentioned, that was less well established, but it had the key advantage that it allowed dates to be given by testing minute fragments of material.
Okay.
So it made.
So was the appeal for that it would be less? I mean, it's a destructive process, and you're dealing with this artifact.
Oh yeah.
That's of course very, very special to so many people. So was that one of the selling points? Was that it was?
I think that was one of the key reasons why it became the time when the carbon dating test would occur. Because it's been talked about ever since, carbon dating goes back to the late 1940s. And from the early 60s, certainly people had talked about the possibility of carbon dating the shroud. But in those days, you would have needed a piece of material the size of a handkerchief to be able to produce any kind of chance of getting an accurate date. And that was clearly always going to be untenable.
Right.
But with the advent of the AMS technique, all of a sudden, with using something that piece of material of the shroud that was maybe the size of a stamp, a postage stamp, or even smaller, it was possible to obtain pretty accurate and reliable results. So
Mm-hmm.
yes, that was a key attraction.
Sure.
Yeah, one of the other key criteria, and a very important one, was that there should be samples taken from multiple areas of the shroud, and this was advice that was born out of practical experience, because the reality is that when you're dealing with ancient objects, parts of those objects can be badly contaminated, and you can't always tell where the contamination appears, where it is. So if you're unlucky and you only take one sample and it's a contaminated part of the item, then you're going to get a wrong date, but
Right.
you won't know that. So the advice was to take multiple samples from multiple areas in order to make sure that the test had integrity. And also, when in doing that, because they had the STIRP team involved in the project, and because they had examined the shroud in detail, one of the key criteria was that the STIRP team would be involved in selecting the areas to be sampled, because they knew the
Right.
cloth, they knew it backwards.
Yeah.
And then finally, and this is something which is key to nearly all good scientific tests, the test should be conducted blind. There should be blind testing. In other words, the laboratories wouldn't know which sample was which. Sorry, I should have made the point there that the British Museum were going to provide control samples that could be tested alongside the shroud.
Sure.
Laboratories would get different samples of materials. They wouldn't know which one was the shroud. They would date them all, give the results back to the British Museum, and because the British Museum would know which sample was the shroud, they could then, and which were each of the control samples, they could then analyze the results. And the purpose of blind testing, the reason for doing this, is that there's always a risk of either having conscious or unconscious bias.
Sure.
If you know
Sure.
what the sample is, and you know what the date should be, or you've got a feeling of what the date should be, there's always a possibility that you can bias the results.
Right.
So that was a reason for employing a blind test procedure.
Basic protective measure to try to increase objectivity and yes.
Exactly.
Right.
and it's usual practice for most scientific tests.
Right.
So these were the key criteria that they'd established were necessary for the test to actually have integrity and for it to be conducted without anybody really disputing it. But even though this plan had taken place, the planning had taken place over several years, but this plan was put together just a year before the test took place. By the time they had started to conduct the test, the plan had begun to unravel. So for instance, they decided that instead of having samples taken from multiple locations on the shroud, they would only take it from a single place. And eventually that was decided that would be in a corner of the shroud. So that was a major change to the protocol, and also one that caused quite a lot of alarm, particularly from those people who'd used carbon dating before and knew the pitfalls. And although the STIRP scientists had been lined up to help advise on where the sample should be taken from, they were actually eliminated from the process. There was one of the directors of one of the radiocarbon laboratories, a man called Harry Gove. He was particularly opposed to members of the STIRP team being involved, because in his view, these people were religious zealots who were likely to try and influence the results,
which is patently false based on everything I know I've ever read, or anyone I've ever talked to that had anything to do with it at all has blown that out of the water.
Yeah, exactly. But he was actually interviewed. I've got a quote here. He was interviewed I think it was in May 1988, so just after the sample's been taken, and he was interviewed for a newspaper, and he actually said, this is talking about the STIRP team, almost with this exception, there were people who honestly believe it's Christ's shroud. And then he goes on to say, this is extraordinary.
Yeah.
It's a well-known fact that scientists can produce whatever result they want. If you believe that passionately in something, you can steer the results. My God, we've all been guilty of that. Now, I'm going to come back to that quotation.
Yeah, we'll put a put a bookmark on that. Jeez.
It's quite an admission, isn't it?
That's the first I've heard that. Yeah, I was pulling up a different one for later that I might mention, but yeah, that that's news to me. Wow. So that was Harry Gove had said that?
Harry Gove said that,
Wow.
yeah, in May 1988. So
Wow.
obviously, the fact that they didn't involve the stamp team, well, that was a problem.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but that's what, 5 months? He made that comment 4 or 5 months before the actual test is done, or the
Yeah,
results are released. Wow. Okay.
yeah, that's right.
So
That's right.
it's
That's correct.
okay.
But
That's
he'd
interesting.
opposed the step team's involvement all the way through
Hmm.
for some reason. Well, for reasons that were clear to him, but not at all clear to most
Hmm.
people. Um, the other changes, major changes, although 7 laboratories were initially intended to be involved, there were only 3 involved in the end.
Right.
And also all 3 of those laboratories used the AMS dating technique, the one which was much more new, more
Sure.
and less well used, less well established.
And
Um,
that's the only one that they use. Is that correct? They did not
that's the
use
only
the
one they
other.
used. Yeah,
Okay, so they all stuck with the AMS. Okay.
they all use the AMS technique. Yeah, and then finally, yeah, key parts of the test was always going to be that it would be conducted blind. But there was a problem, and that was that the shroud's weave was, as you'll know, Mike, it was um, a very elegant herringbone weave,
Hmm.
whereas all the control samples had a plain weave. So
Hmm.
as soon as anybody opened the canisters containing each of these samples, even though they weren't marked to say which was which, they could immediately tell which was the shroud sample because of the weave.
Hmm.
So, in effect, there wasn't a blind test procedure, even though, to all intents and purposes, they tried to maintain the illusion that there was.
So of course, with the blind test, the goal would be to have the control samples visually appear as similar that it wouldn't,
Yeah,
immediately catch your eye. Okay, that makes sense.
yeah, and and,
Yeah.
and I mean, interestingly, Michael Tite, one of the things he was doing as part of his role within as test supervisor, is that he was using all the British Museum's resources, plus all their own connections to
Hmm.
museums all over the world, to try and find medieval samples of material that had herringbone weave that matched the shroud or that was similar to the shroud. He couldn't
Hmm.
find them. He
Wow.
couldn't find any samples with a similar a similar
Wow.
weave.
Well, I
So
imagine that those British museums resources are probably as as
yeah,
substantial as any museums is in the world. That's, I mean, they're
yeah,
established and yeah. Hmm.
yeah. So in effect, there wasn't a blind test protocol. So really, before the
Interesting.
test took place, uh, there was already a lot of reasons why people were beginning to get concerned. Of course, the labs then went on to take the samples that they'd been given. They made their measurements. And then on the 13th of October 1988, the test result was announced, the famous 1260 to 1390 AD exclamation mark, and the declaration that there's a 95% probability. So they were very confident that that was the date range of the fabric of the shroud. And they basically had concluded that it was therefore a medieval forgery.
Hmm.
Unfortunately, at the time that they made that announcement, they didn't provide any details of the actual measurements. They didn't provide anything other than scant details of the test process itself. So there was very little information that anybody could use to challenge the British Museum and the laboratories on their announcement.
Hmm.
And so naturally, the conclusion that the Shroud is a medieval forgery hit the newspapers, hit the TV news reports, and that spread around the world. It was only about 5 months later, in February 1989, that the test report was produced. And that's when all of a sudden people began to see that it wasn't really as straightforward as had been indicated. There were several errors, several inconsistencies and miscalculations that were immediately evident to people who took the trouble to analyze that test report in detail. Some of them are really quite some of the errors were really quite difficult to difficult to understand, really. I mean, one of them was they actually, Michael Tite in the test report had said that the sample that was removed from the shroud measured 7 centimeters long by 1 centimeter wide. That was wrong. It was 8.1 centimeters long by 1 centimeters wide. In total, it was almost twice the size that he said in the report. I mean, interestingly, about 3 or 4 months later, after the test report had been produced, he was asked about this, he was questioned about this, and his response was that the 7 by 1 dimensions that he put in the report was a figure that he looked from his memory. Now, that dimension would have been recorded.
Yeah.
Why?
Well, that excuse wouldn't. I just that wouldn't pass muster with a middle school science teacher if you're writing a paper. I mean, I couldn't get away with that in seventh grade. Okay.
No, clearly not.
Huh.
Yeah. And there was another matter as well, because quite ridiculously, Michael Tite, who'd given the samples to the laboratories to test, so you got the shroud sample plus there were 3 control samples. He actually told them what the dates were of the control samples. That information was recorded on the receipts that they had. So, in effect, what they were doing was they were testing 4 sets of material, but they knew the result they should be getting for 3 of those, of those samples that they were testing. They knew what the answer was before they ran the test. Again, he was questioned about this about 3 months later, and he said, let me see, I think I've got the quotation here. Oh, no, I haven't. Sorry, I've written down a few quotations because I'm referring to them. But basically what he said was, yes, in hindsight, it would have been better if they hadn't known those dates. Now, back to what you said, I mean, this is an experienced scientist from the British Museum running what was possibly, at the time, one of the world's most closely observed scientific projects. And so for him to actually admit, in hindsight, it would have been a good idea not to tell them the result that they should be getting.
Well, and that was something that was expressly, it seems to me, included in the way the protocols were originally set up to avoid those kinds of things happening at all. So that's far from hindsight, if you ask me. But
well, exactly. Right. It's very, very strange. But
yes,
there were lots of reasons why people could be very critical of the Shroud dating report. But it's really when we go to have a look at the results themselves that it gets even more contentious and it gets even more problematic. Because, and for people who are not familiar with carbon dating, it is obviously a very complex scientific process. And unlike simple measurements, such as measuring the height of a door or measuring the weight of a bag of sugar, with those simple measurements, every time you measure the height of the door or every time you weigh a bag of sugar, you'd expect to get the same result every single time. But with complex measurements, such as using radiocarbon dating to measure the age of an ancient object, you don't get the same results every time. But what you do expect is that the results should be clustered around the true value. So, for instance, if you're measuring the age of a 300-year-old piece of fabric, say, then what you would expect is that some of the measurements would be less than 300 years, some would be more.
Mm-hmm.
Hopefully, they'd all be averaging around 300 years. And depending on the spread, how widely spread those results are, then typically what the people who make those measurements would do is give you what they call the mean date, which
Mm-hmm.
would be 300 years, and then a margin of error, which is usually expressed as
Right.
plus or minus 25 years or plus or minus 50 years, something like that.
Right.
Okay, so that's the way in which we measure. That's what you expect when you're using radiocarbon dating.
And Michael, if I may ask on that, that the margin of error, is that set basically by all sorts of different conditions based on the time frame of the particular item they're looking at? Or, I mean, is it easier to maybe narrow that down if it's a younger object versus an older one? I'm not entirely sure how that works.
Well, it's based on two things, really. First of all, it's based upon metrics associated with the equipment itself. So how accurate
Sure.
the individual measurements should be based on the equipment used and the sample. But but also but also when you take multiple measurements of the same piece of material, then what you can do is consolidate those measurements together.
Mm-hmm.
And the more measurements that you make, usually what happens is the margin of error reduces.
Sure. Sure.
So, and in fact,
Which is
if you
why it
look
would have
at,
been better, for example, to have 7 labs instead of 3
yes,
testing
yeah,
it. Okay.
that's right.
And doing 2 different methods, right? So, okay. Yeah.
So at this point, Mike, if you could put up the first slide,
Yes.
because it'd be good
Yeah.
to refer to a few slides over the next minute or two.
Yeah. Let me get that here. Oops. Wrong one there. Let me jump over to it. The joys of technology. I am happy that it works. There we are. Okay. So, can you see that there
Excellent.
showing up? Okay.
Yeah. So what we've got here, as I mentioned before, Mike, what you'd expect to see is a spread of results with over a different over a period of days.
Mm-hmm.
So what we've got here are results that were obtained by the laboratories when they measured the age of one of the control samples. So
Okay.
the red circles are the dates achieved by Arizona,
Mm-hmm.
and so they range from I think it was 826 AD to 1016 AD, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Oxford made 3 measurements, which were the ones which are indicated by the blue triangles, and Zurich, they also made 5 different measurements for that control sample. And again, all of them got a range of dates. And as you can see there, they're fairly randomly spread. They're all roughly the same. All the dates seem to overlap
Yeah.
between all the laboratories. It's a good random spread that you would expect to see.
Yeah.
However, when we look at the shroud measurements, which is on the next slide,
Mm-hmm.
we get a very different pattern here
Hmm.
because, as you can see there quite clearly, the Arizona dates, they're the most recent because they're just, it's at the bottom where we've got the age in years. They're
Mm-hmm.
ranging from just below 600 years old to just above 700 years old.
Yes.
Zurich are giving a slightly different age range. They're getting a slightly older age range across their samples, but Oxford's is way over to the right.
Mm-hmm.
Oxford, the data ranges given by Oxford were much older than every one of the measurements made by Zurich and Arizona, apart from one of the Zurich measurements.
Right. Yes.
It
So
doesn't
that
look,
first little blue triangle versus the last green diamond, they can see
that's
those.
correct.
But other
Yeah.
than that, yes. Huh.
So it doesn't look like a random spread. In fact, yeah, when you look at that, it's almost as if something's wrong with Oxford's measurements.
Hmm.
a little bit like when you jump on some weighing scales and you think you should be weighing 14 stone. It turns out you weigh 14 stone 7.
Right.
And you can blame the scales when it might have been the fact that you've been on holiday for 2 weeks. But
Or you still have your shoes on, or there's some discernible reason, right? Yeah.
yeah. So there's something very strange in these measurements, and it's interesting that this was borne out by the statistical analysis. So if we go on to the next slide, Mike, and I'd just like to draw. I know for many people, as soon as you see lists of numbers like this, the reviewers will no doubt begin to glaze over at the sight of this. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about it.
Well, I was going to say that's why you're here, to help us through.
What I've highlighted there is a figure that was produced. This is a table that was produced from the test report.
Okay.
And there's a figure down at the bottom there that the scientists who produced the report referred to as the significance level. Now, what this means, the significance level, this is it's a way of being able to measure what the chances are of getting this spread of results if the only reason for the disparity between the different measurements were random measurements errors. So what this is saying, a significance level for the shroud of 5%, much lower than the control samples, you'll notice as well, where there's 90%, 50%, and 30%. The significance level for the shroud of 5%, that means that there was there's only a 5% chance that those measurements that were made by the 3 laboratories, that spread of measurements could have arisen by random measurement errors alone, which means there's a 95% chance that there must have been some kind of systematic error.
Right. Something far more significantly wrong. Okay.
Now, an obvious example would have been that maybe there was something wrong with the Oxford Laboratories equipment.
Right.
That caused it to measure the dates, to give older date measurements than the other 2 labs. Now, if that was the case, then we'd have expected that to be the case on all the control samples as well. But Oxford didn't give the oldest results on all the control samples. Indeed, for 2 of the control samples, it gave dates that were in the middle.
Yeah.
It wasn't that there's a problem with the Oxford laboratory measurements. So what else could it be? Well, the only other plausible explanation is that there was something different in the samples that were being measured by Oxford, by Zurich, and Arizona. Now, they were all adjacent to each other, taken from one corner of the shroud, but there must be something different, some difference in the sample.
Right. Yeah, they weren't identical pieces of cloth, right? They were adjacent, of course, but not exactly the same, right?
Not exactly the same. They were adjacent to each other. And what this really indicates is there must have been some kind of contamination. That's the only plausible explanation for a systematic error that would have affected these measurements.
I see.
So that's the other interesting point as well about this significance level measurement is that 5%, from a statistician's point of view, a value of 5% there, that's a key threshold. Because when you take measurements and you do this test, if the significance level is less than 5%, then most statisticians would just simply reject the test as being invalid. Because if it's below 5%, there's a less than 1 in 20 chance that these results could be the result of random measurement errors alone. So therefore, something's gone wrong. So
in other words, that's the lowest possible acceptable threshold.
It is. That's correct. Now, interesting, really, that its a round number is 5. So I wonder what it was before it was rounded.
Right.
Was it 5, or was it below?
Right. Was it 4.5 or 6? Like, yeah.
Well, if we go on to the next slide, because it's possible to recalculate this. And so we can recalculate this from the other information that's contained in that table. And when we do that, we find that the
Wow.
results is not 5%, but 4.18%,
Which does not round up to 5.
which does not like round it to 5, correct?
Huh.
Not, and I mean, I
Wow.
must admit, I sometimes I'm tempted to use the term it's a schoolboy error, but
Well,
schoolboy
and again, is
is
that
a
so?
mistake.
Is that from the raw data that recalculated value is? Because I understand that the raw data was not available till forced to be available. Is that correct? From the Freedom of Information request?
Yeah, it's
Uh,
correct that the raw data wasn't available at this time, but this
yeah.
is a calculation that can be made using the information that's contained in that
The
table.
in their actual report. Okay, interesting.
Those three
Wow.
results at the top,
Yes.
the Arizona result, the
Mm-hmm.
Oxford results, and the Zurich result, it's a fairly simple calculation to make.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, so it's uh, it's not complex mathematics by any
Hmm.
means. Um,
Interesting.
so yes, it was somehow rounded up incorrectly from 4.18 5%. Now, that's a clear and obvious error, and this was spotted immediately. There were a couple of scientists in particular who were able to point out errors in the test reports fairly shortly after it was produced. One was an Italian engineer named Ernesto Brunati,
Mm-hmm.
uh, who spotted several errors, and I'll cover some others in a moment. And another was a Belgian chemist called Remy van Heelst,
Mm.
of whom um, not only found errors, but tried to get answers from the laboratories and from the British Museum, sadly without success.
Mm.
But let's have a look at some more of the errors that occurred,
Sure.
because it wasn't only there that there was a problem. Again,
Now.
uh, in a different table of the test report, it printed out all the details of they gave all the details of the 4 measurements that were made by the Arizona laboratory. And from those 4 measurements, it's possible to calculate the the overall measurement for Arizona that appears in this table.
Mm.
Now, when you perform that calculation, and again, it's fairly basic maths that is used to make that calculation. When you perform that calculation, you get not 646 plus or minus 31 years, but you get 646 plus or minus 17 years. And indeed, if we go on to the next slide, Mike, that's a
Mm-hmm.
major difference, but it wasn't the only one. The Oxford result was slightly wrong as well. I mean,
Hmm.
this is like the kind of, it looks like a really bad homework assignment after it's been marked, doesn't
Right.
it? It's just, so you've got errors in the Arizona result that's recorded, the errors in the Oxford result. This means that the weighted mean down at the bottom, which is calculated from those 3 results for Oxford, Arizona, and Zurich, that weighted mean was incorrect.
Hmm.
The chi-squared value is incorrect, and the significance level has gone down, not from
I see.
5%, but not from 4.18, but it goes down to 1.43.
Wow.
So
Wow. So even right. So even if all of these errors are included, you still get the 4.18, which shouldn't be rounded up to 5, but that's still including multiple other errors here that should be taken into account, rendering the significance level significantly lower.
exactly.
Okay. Wow.
So now this is, as I mentioned before, I think anybody who's got an interest in maths, and certainly anybody who's used fairly basic statistics, would be able
Hmm.
to perform these calculations. Um, so it does beg the question, how on earth did this test report ever
Hmm.
manage to be published in what was one of the leading scientific journals at the time?
Yes. Do
So
we do you still want this up here, or should I
no,
jump
no, you
back
can
for now?
take that
I'll
down
hang on
now.
to that. Yeah, that's and so that so again, so this is October 1988, and then and I have the link here too below. I can't get the full article on here. I think somebody sent me a link a while back. Actually, I might be able to retrieve it, but I'm on Nature's website now, and there. I mean, you can, if you have a subscription, of course, you can pull it up. It's still posted there. And
Yeah,
if I find if I can find, we'll know by the time people are watching this. If I can find the direct link to the entire article, I don't remember if it was you that sent me that or Joe Marino or somebody sent it to me. But we'll put links for people to access the report one way or the other below there.
Yeah.
Title Radiocarbon Dating of the Shroud of Turin. They have all the different authors there. Nature 337, pages 611 to 615, 1989. February 16th, 1989, just to be precise. So
Yeah.
that's that's the report here, right? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So yeah, it's quite intriguing because first of all, the Nature magazine, the Nature scientific journal, it was very much a leading scientific journal at the time. It was probably the most prominent scientific journal used for publishing details about new discoveries or new scientific research, original scientific research. And indeed, that those were criteria for articles being accepted for publication. They should
Mm-hmm.
be groundbreaking in some way. Now, I think many scientists have argued, many shroud scientists have argued that you couldn't really, from a scientific point of view, you couldn't really argue that the carbon dating of the shroud was a scientific innovation. We've been carbon dating ancient objects for many, many years, and this was from a scientific point of view, not from a religious point of view or a spiritual point of view, but from a scientific point of view, this was just another ancient object. So it didn't really have scientific merit as a test. The only aspect of the test that could be considered to be in any way different or unusual was the fact that they had 3 laboratories involved in the dating rather than 1. And they were consolidating the results from the 3 independent laboratories using statistical methods. So that was slightly new.
Mm-hmm.
The other aspect, which is a bit of an intriguing point, is that it's a peer-reviewed journal, so that the article, the tables that we've just been looking at, they would have been reviewed by people whose job it was to ensure that this was fit for purpose, that this report was correct. Now, these are fairly basic errors, so one has to wonder either how that happened, how it got through, because it seems to indicate that either myself and many, many other people before me who pointed out these errors, these what appear to be very serious flaws, either these flaws are not as significant as we believe them to be, or perhaps the peer review process, well, that was flawed in some way itself. Maybe they didn't scrutinize the reports as carefully as possible. Now, there is some evidence that perhaps a less rigorous process was applied with Nature, because the article was submitted in December 1988, and it was published in February 1989. And for a peer-reviewed article, that is not a long time. That's a few weeks. Usually it takes several months, 6 months, sometimes more. So it appears from that it was maybe rushed through.
Yeah, fast-tracked for some reason. Yeah.
Yeah. But there was also a comment that was made by the director of the Zurich laboratory who was involved in the test, who was a man called Willy Wolfley. He was interviewed in 1989, and he actually made the comment that in all his career as a scientist, he'd published hundreds of reports in peer-reviewed journals, and this was the only time that he knew that a report that he'd written had been accepted for publication before it had been written. So,
well, and I'd like to this is funny. I was the human side of this. I just want to comment real quick, because I can't help but think here, and this is a subject that's come up in different ways. It's come up with the Shroud. It's come up with this, and other things I've discussed on this channel before. I think sometimes we have, in our kind of modern era here, this default, especially in layman's attitude, because I'm a layman, I'm not a scientist, but I have had so many conversations or just observed in other people, family, friends, students, who themselves aren't scientists, but who just have this kind of baseline faith and trust in, quote, science. And if you ask, like, they don't really know what they mean by that. I see neighbors have the sign out, "I believe in science." And I'm like, that's a creedal statement. That's not a scientific statement.
No, no.
Science is by its nature an endeavor that is loaded with challenges and possible mistakes and revisions and a whole process that
Yeah.
it's not dogmatic. And it troubles me when I see, for example, sometimes people try to pretend that there isn't as much potential. I'm not accusing anyone of anything. I'm not qualified to do that. But there is as at least as much potential in the process of basically getting something like this published. At least as much potential for human error, for human temptation, for agendas. There's at least as much of that in this realm as there is anywhere else that humans are. And I just think sometimes people are a little naive about that. They just assume all scientists are really, and I'm not accusing anyone, but they just, I think, assume dangerously that all scientists follow a set exact process and it's objective. And I just think we have to be careful about assuming that.
I
Um,
I think so, and in
yeah,
fact, the next part will, I think, totally endorse your concerns here, Mike, because
please.
there's very, very clear evidence that that there was an agenda at play here. There's very clear evidence, which I'll cover, because the editor of Nature was a man called John Maddox, who was considered to be a very, very good editor of that journal, because in fact he before he took over that role, it had been in decline.
Mm,
And he managed to reinvigorate it and make it very much one of the leading journals of the time. So he did a very good job as editor, but he was
hmm
also an extremely controversial character.
hmm.
Um, Now, just over a year ago, in fact, it was April last year, I listened to a radio broadcast. And what drew me to it was there were two members of the BSKS who were going to be talking about the Shroud. One was David Rolfe and another was Peter Wadhams. They were going to be talking about the Shroud, but another guest on this program was a man called Professor Sir Colin Humphreys, who was a material scientist, but he was also a man who had a great interest in Bible studies.
Hmm.
And he mentioned on this, he talked on this program about an experience he'd had when he came to publish a report in 1973 on some research that he'd done. He and a colleague who was an astrophysicist named Graham Waddington, they'd been doing some research to try and establish the definitive date of the crucifixion of Jesus. And so what they'd done was they'd looked at the Gospels, the Gospel accounts. They looked at Jewish and Roman historical texts, and they'd also developed, or Graham Waddington had helped develop, a computer model which enabled them to calculate the phases of the moon that would have been observed as they would have been observed in first century Jerusalem around the time that of the Passion and
Hmm.
the life of Jesus. And this, of course, the Jewish calendar was a lunar calendar. And so the phases of the moon were important in that it's by following the phases of the moon that you can determine when Passover would have occurred in any year.
Hmm.
And by combining all this information, the various different historical and biblical texts and the computer models, they came to the conclusion that the date of the crucifixion was the 3rd of April, 33 AD.
Hmm.
Now, they they sent a paper into Nature, and John Maddox was the editor at the time. That was 1983. They sent the paper into Nature. They were dealing with the natural science editor, the sub-editor who worked on this kind of paper. He sent it out for peer review and came back to Colin Humphreys and said the peer review comments have been excellent. In fact, so much so that I'd like to make this a cover story for the magazine, the next issue. But then a few days later, he came back and said, there's a problem. It won't be the cover story. John Maddox didn't want to publish the article at all But we persuaded him to put it in. Now, Colin Humphreys said that when he was describing this incident, he said that John Maddox was well known as to be, and I quote him, a militant atheist.
Mm.
He said,
Hmm.
so it wasn't too much of a surprise to Colin Humphreys, but nonetheless, it did eventually get published. But a few days after the magazine appeared, the journal appeared, Colin Humphreys was contacted by telephone by John Maddox himself. And he rang him to say, I've had a lot of correspondence about your article, and the comments blow your ideas out of the water. And I'm going to be printing all those letters in the next edition of the journal. So Colin Humphreys said, well, that's fine, but I'd like to see them, and I'd like to have the right of reply. And John Maddox agreed to that. So the letters were sent to Colin Humphreys. Colin Humphreys didn't have any difficulty dealing with the objections or dealing with the comments that were made, was able to answer them very robustly and refute any allegations that his research had been flawed. He sent off his responses, and apparently there were 4 pages that were allocated to be published in the journal. 4 pages of letters with Colin Humphreys' responses that were due to be published, but they were pulled at the last minute. Apparently, John Maddox pulled them because rather than undermining the research, when combined with the responses, they actually made the research look even better. So John Maddox refused to publish the letters as it would have enhanced the claims that were being made by Colin Humphreys. Now, me, that those are extraordinary lengths that somebody might go to. It's an extraordinary use of editorial power, but the name John Maddox.
That's not just an oversight, or I mean that's a very deliberate process and
very deliberate, yeah,
philosophical based, kind of or his own philosophical assumptions really playing out in his decisions there, it would seem.
Yeah. Well, what was interesting was when John Maddox was a name that was familiar to me, but I couldn't think why. And as I was listening to this, I was trying to remember where it came from. Why do I remember the name John Maddox? And very shortly afterwards, it came to me because back in the 1990s, there'd been a BBC series called Heretics, which was all about the dogma that exists in science that actually is preventing scientists from making groundbreaking discoveries from time to time. And I recalled a program in that series, which was a fascinating documentary about a French immunologist called Jacques Benveniste. He was quite an eminent research scientist, and his career was effectively destroyed when he crossed swords with John Maddox. And I'll take this story because it's very, very relevant to the Shroud, is this? Because back in what happened was Jacques Benveniste, he ran a laboratory with about 40 technicians. As I say, he was an immunologist, and one day one of his laboratory staff came to him, and he presented some results from some research he'd been doing, which seemed to support the principles of homeopathy. What he found was that if he took a solution containing antibodies, then no matter how many times he diluted that solution, when he introduced it to some blood cells, there was an effect on the blood cells. So Jacques Benveniste thought, that can't be right. You must have made a mistake. So he got one of his leading technicians to repeat the experiment, and they got exactly the same results. So he decided to do a little bit more detailed research into this. And to cut a long story short, after several years, and after involving not only his own technical staff, but also staff from laboratories and independent laboratories in different countries around the world, he had a a body of evidence that he compiled into a scientific paper, and he submitted it to Nature in 1988. And initially, this paper, it was put through the review process. The scientific reviews were all very acceptable. There was no problem at all with the science. But John Maddox refused to publish it, and refused to publish it because he said there is no scientific basis for these results. Now, Jack Benveniste objected quite strongly.
Yeah. Well, and I
Uh,
showed him the data.
yes, yeah.
Interesting.
Well, Jack Benveniste objected, and
Yeah.
John Maddox eventually agreed to publish it, but on one condition: that a committee that he would lead would be allowed to come to Jack Benveniste's laboratories, and they would be able to validate the experiments and validate the research. So he published it, and the committee came to the laboratory in France. Now, I think what Jack Benveniste in the documentary, this is all covered in a documentary, and I'll give you the link as well, Mike.
Yes, yeah, please.
Because it is fascinating. It's available on YouTube. It's the documentary. It is fascinating. Jack Benveniste probably expected to see somebody who was a fellow immunologist, or at least some biologists with practical experience of scientific research of his type. The committee consisted of John Maddox, an American stage magician named James Randi, and an American chemist called Walter Stewart. These two people had reputations as fraudbusters. And it was interesting that in the documentary, John Maddox is interviewed, and he said that he had discussed his concerns about Jack Benveniste's paper with some colleagues of his in America who were concerned at scientific fraud. Very interesting phrase, that. Some colleagues of mine in America concerned about scientific fraud. And I'll come back to that in a minute.
Yeah.
So the three of them, they interviewed the people involved in the test. And again, John Maddox made the point that they began to be a little bit suspicious that something funny was going on, because they hadn't been always using blind test procedures. So they repeated the experiments. The original plan was that John Maddox's team would be observers, but actually they ended up participating in the tests, even though they were not qualified to do so. Jack Benveniste describes it as a pantomime. Apparently, James Randi, the magician, he was doing magic tricks to the amusement of the staff who were supposed to be conducting the tests, and distracting them from the work that they were doing. Not surprisingly, at the end of this, the result they got didn't back up they didn't repeat the positive results that they've been getting when they conducted the tests under normal laboratory circumstances. And the committee left. John Maddox went back to London, and then in the next issue of Nature, he published an absolutely very robust rebuttal of the experiments of Jack Benveniste's papers in an article entitled "High Dilution Experiments: A Delusion," and effectively
that's got a nice ring to it.
To Jack Benveniste's career.
Wow.
So what we've got here is something really quite interesting. You've got an editor here who's not only a militant atheist, but he's also somebody who's prepared to use his editorial powers uh, to go to extreme lengths in basically undermining anything that doesn't fit with his own belief system.
Yeah.
Now, but what was most unusual about this was his choice of companions, in particular, a stage magician
Yeah.
in James Randi. Why would he involve James Randi? Well, what's interesting is James Randi is not only a stage magician, he was also a founder member of an organization called the Committee of Skeptical Inquiry into Claims of Paranormal, or
Mm-hmm.
CSICOP for short.
Mm-hmm.
This was an organization that was founded in 1976, and it's an organization that was founded to try and debunk claims of paranormal or pseudoscience.
Okay.
And the executive director, when it was founded, I'll quote what he said. He's talking about claims of paranormal. He said, "It's a very dangerous phenomenon, dangerous to science, dangerous to the basic fabric of our society. We feel it is the duty of the scientific community to show that these beliefs are utterly screwball."
Hmm.
Now, that's this organization that James Randi belonged to, but also John Maddox. It's interesting that John Maddox referred to his colleagues in America who were concerned about scientific fraud. Now, both James Randi and John Maddox were later made distinguished fellows of CSICOP. There's very,
Hmm.
very clearly a close association between John Maddox and this organization, a very close association. Now, why is that a concern for the Shroud? Well, interestingly, in 1987, the year before the Shroud was dated, another member of CSI Corp, who is Carl Sagan, who you'll probably be
Mm-hmm.
familiar with. He was a scientist and author, famous scientist and author. He was a founder member of CSI Corp as well. And he rather helpfully gave a list of targets when interviewed in 1987. So some of the targets, some of the things that they were interested in debunking included astrology, claims that the Earth is really flat, claims of crashed flight saucers, the Loch Ness Monster, Bigfoot, and also in that list was the Shroud of Turin.
Hmm.
So the
Lumped
editor of
in, lumped
Nature
in with with
lumped
those
in with
others, as
those.
if that's a fair way to characterize all of them. Yeah, interesting.
So the editor of Nature was not only a militant atheist, but he was also a man who was at the very least extremely closely associated with an organization who had a stated intention to debunk the belief in the authenticity of the Shroud of Turin.
Hmm.
So there was very much an agenda at play here.
Yeah.
And it's fairly clear that this might have been a good reason why, despite all the flaws associated with the test report, despite all of those, he may well have decided to publish it anyway,
Hmm.
publish a report that undermined the credibility of the Shroud as a religious relic.
Right. Well, and it's not like it was any mystery that you cross that threshold when you do officially commit and publish something like that. You cross that threshold of opening it up to somewhat of I don't know, a niche audience, in that not everybody's going to read that, but it is going to influence reporting, and then that's going to trickle down and get out, as it did, and it was on every newspaper, it was broadcast everywhere, and then you do
Yeah,
get it into this cultural sort of zeitgeist of like, oh yeah, the Shroud's been disproven,
yeah,
when 99% of the people who think that probably haven't actually looked at the data.
yeah.
I mean, the things you're showing us here today, I mean, that's the first I've seen those details specifically. I've seen others, but so that, yeah, I do have to wonder about that, in terms of, there's no way that that he didn't know, or that the editorial team didn't know. Like, it's known what effect these things will have potentially
Oh,
on the broader culture. So that
uh,
obviously must have been taken into account.
absolutely. I mean,
Yeah.
from a scientific point of view, the fact that there was the announcement, obviously, that the fact that the paper was published in Nature and given Nature's reputation, that carried an incredible amount of authority.
Mm-hmm.
So he really was underlining the credibility by publishing that report. He was underlining the credibility of the research.
Yeah.
And now, fortunately, because of the freedom of information request made by Tristan Casabianca
Yeah.
in 2017, we now know what actually happened in the peer review process. So we can go beyond mere speculation now that the peer review process was not quite as effective as it should have been. We
Yeah.
now know what happened. We know now that the paper was submitted on December the 6th, that it was published on February the 19th, that it was only peer reviewed by 2 people. That just for comparison, the Colin Humphreys article that I mentioned earlier, that was reviewed by 4.
Mm-hmm.
And the 2 peer reviewers, they only gave very, very brief responses, but one of them was really quite interesting. Even though he only had half a page of responses, this one reviewer made 2 points that I think are worth noting. First of all, he says, it's extremely unfortunate that the blind test protocols were not followed. In fact, they were abandoned. Now, isn't it interesting that John Maddox, when he rejected Jack Benvenist's paper in 1988, one of the key things was that he complained about was they weren't following blind test procedures.
Mm-hmm.
So
And to be clear, that article that you're mentioning there, I had that brought up, and I'm linking all this below. That was the high dilution
yeah,
experiments delusion was Nature 334,
right.
July 1988. So just 6 months later, basically.
Yeah,
Yet then he's seemingly reversing that
yes.
criteria, or downplaying the importance of it with this. This seems strange.
Exactly. If he was being consistent, this comment by the peer reviewer would have been a big red flag.
Mm-hmm.
And similarly, the same man went on to say, I suspect that a statistician could raise some serious technical questions, but that is not the point of the paper. Now, I'm sorry, anybody who's read the Shroud, the Shroud test report, if they're not interested in statistics, they won't find a great deal there that would be of interest
Right.
to them, because the paper is full of it's well, the main point of the paper is the statistical analysis. It was the
Yeah.
statistical analysis of the individual measurements that led them to their conclusion. So for the reviewer to say a statistician could raise some technical questions, but that is not the point of the paper,
What
that's
is it? Yeah.
bizarre. Now, at the
Strange.
very least, what John Maddox should have done as editor is, if he didn't want to reject the paper, at the very least, what he should have done is mention in the editorial that there were reasons to be severely concerned about this.
Mm.
But clearly, he had no wish to do so,
Right.
for the
Or
reasons that
to
are
in other words,
outlined.
like to basically invite further conversation or further study, or hey, let's take the next step. But this is very
Yeah,
much put out as a definitive next subject because we're done with this, and that's exactly how it's been treated by probably the vast majority of people. Although the tide hopefully seems to be turning a little bit, at least to be able to talk about these things more. you
yeah,
know,
yeah. I think it's absolutely true. I think if people can get beyond the carbon dating,
yeah,
and it is a big, big hurdle for anybody.
sure,
When the British Museum and several carbon dating laboratories and the Nature Journal all come out and say it's medieval forgery, it takes a lot of effort to break down the belief that they
yeah,
might be wrong.
right,
But nonetheless, I think thanks to your program, your series of podcasts, Mike, and the work of many other people around the world who are presenting this evidence, hopefully, gradually,
yeah,
this will emerge and become part of the consciousness
yeah,
of humanity, that actually there is a problem with that carbon dating, and that in fact, when you weigh up all the evidence, the dating evidence, the other evidence relating to the Shroud of Turin, there is enough there to be able to claim beyond reasonable
yeah.
doubt that it is an authentic relic of the Passion of Jesus Christ.
And and thank you so much. I'm so delighted, to have you on here today and to have all these guests, where, I mean, I see my role in a lot of this as, simply to host these conversations and I really think I do see this and am participating hopefully in maybe this next phase, of 10, 15 years ago, I could get my hands on some pretty interesting documentaries. There were some good documentaries out there. There still are, of course. But I do see this shift happening too, in parallel ways. There's a lot of other good channels too, where you're seeing these more long form conversations going into deeper elements of it. And sometimes having debates, of course, and that kind of stuff. I haven't moved that direction with this as much, just because of timing and planning,
Yeah.
but just, Michael, anything else, this has been such a delightful and really intriguing conversation. I encourage people to check out the links. Is there anything else you want to share or just say kind of in closing for now you'd point people to?
Well, certainly, I think what I would do, Mike, is well, first of all, can I thank you for the opportunity
Oh, my pleasure.
uh, I think it's possible to write about all this but the format that you provide is one that will reach other people that are not going to be that interested in looking for and then reading the kind of books and papers that cover this kind of thing.
Sure.
So thanks very much. You
No,
do
my
such a
pleasure.
great job in helping us to get this message out.
Oh,
But
thank you.
what I would encourage people to do is, if you feel at all intrigued by any of the things which I've talked about relating to the Shroud, do look at some of the links below.
Mm-hmm.
Do also look for other information, other podcasts that you've run, and also other source of information. Shroud.com is a great
Yeah.
one. There is a lot of evidence relating to the Shroud. There's a lot of evidence that really does stack up to confirm that the Shroud is authentic, in my view. And I think if anybody has an interest in it, it's definitely worth pursuing.
Yeah. Absolutely. Couldn't agree more. Well, Michael Kowalski, thank you so much for coming on the Gracious Guest Show here today and sharing with us, and we'll definitely have you back to continue the conversation, I'm sure.
Oh, thank you so much, Mike. It's been a pleasure.
Yep. God bless you.
And you.
It was a really intriguing conversation, I think, and was one that had me on the edge of my seat in some ways, a couple times throughout. And I think the only thing I wanted to kind of leave you all with, just to think about, something that I've been meditating on quite a bit after we had this conversation, which was a few weeks ago, by the way, because of the beard, you can tell. I've had a trim. But what really came to my mind throughout this conversation and in reflecting on it afterwards is just the reality of human nature, the temptations that we all fall into. And I want to be clear, I'm not directly accusing anyone of anything, right? This is no judgment on my part. This is some things to consider. If you want to dig deeper, of course, you can look into Michael's book. I encourage you to sort of do some research on your own, to continue to read, to continue to reach out to people who have experience with the Shroud. And it's so easy for all of us to have confirmation bias. It's so easy for all of us to have biases of all sorts. There's certain things we want to be true. There's certain things we don't want to be true. And at the end of the day, I have to try to recognize that whether or not I want something to be true, if it's true, it's true. If it's false, it's false. And so I think sometimes in conversations like this, we see the negative effects of this very materialistic, very reductionist, very relativistic kind of time that we live in, bearing out in our own thoughts, our own actions. And so I'm as victim to that as anybody else. I'm as guilty of that as anybody else. But I think we can all do a better job to try to consider that, for one thing, just because something is in a scientific journal doesn't automatically mean it's correct, doesn't automatically mean it's been vetted correctly, doesn't automatically mean the process is somehow perfect and pure and pristine and above suspicion or above questioning. I know lots of scientists who would agree with that, my wife among them, quite frankly. Sometimes there are human weaknesses that play into, or other agendas that can play into the peer review process. And so that's something I want to share out there. I'm sure I'll see some of this in the comment threads, people bringing things like this up. So this is just something to consider, I think. How do we know, right? How do you know anything? It's who do you trust? And that's why I love to do things like this on this channel, because at the end of the day, topics aside, the Shroud is a wonderfully intriguing topic. It's not remotely the only thing that I'm interested in. It's not remotely the source of my own faith. It brings up deeper questions. How do you make the decision of who to trust? That's a very profound thing, and something I think we all need to continue to meditate on and to pray about and to work our way through. So God bless you all. Thank you for dropping by here on the Gracious Guest Show today. I really hope you'll share this with someone today, that you'll subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. A lot of great new content coming up pretty soon, so stay tuned, and until next time, don't forget to wonder. Take care.